The courtroom buzzed with restrained energy, a hum of whispers and shuffled papers filling the space. Today wasn't just another day at the city courthouse. Word had spread that someone notorious would be appearing before one of the most no-nonsense judges in the district. Enter Maya Delaney, a social media influencer infamous for her lavish lifestyle and unapologetically brazen personality. Known for flaunting rules as much as her designer wardrobe, Maya wasn't someone to take lightly or seriously, depending on whom you asked. When she finally arrived, fashionably late, the room seemed to tilt under the weight of her presence. She strutted in, wrapped in a glittering jumpsuit that sparkled like paparazzi flashbulbs, her platinum blonde hair cascading over her shoulders. Maya's oversized sunglasses didn't just hide her eyes. They announced her disinterest in everything and everyone around her. Her lawyer, a nervous man in an ill-fitted suit, scurried behind her, his whispered warnings falling on deaf ears. Unfazed by the stares, Maya stopped in the aisle, tossing her bag onto the bench with a careless shrug. She smirked, scanning the room as though gauging her audience. Her bravado oozed entitlement, but it wasn't long before the murmur of voices quieted. Judge Marcus Kane entered, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an aura that could silence a crowd without a word. His dark, piercing eyes scanned the room, lingering on Maya for a fleeting moment before he took his seat. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and everyone stood. Well, almost everyone. Maya hesitated, rolling her eyes before standing with an exaggerated sigh. Her posture screamed defiance, but Judge Kane didn't flinch. He adjusted his robe, his gaze sharp and calculating, then opened the file before him. The air seemed to thicken as the proceedings began. Maya's case wasn't headline-worthy. On paper, it was a combination of unpaid fines and a reckless driving charge. Yet, her dismissive attitude turned what could have been a routine hearing into a spectacle. As Judge Kane began listing the charges, Maya slumped back in her seat, crossing her arms like a petulant child. She twirled a strand of hair, her nails tapping against the wooden table, deliberately loud. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, but she brushed him off, muttering, "Relax, it's just traffic tickets." Her response was met with a ripple of murmurs from the gallery, but Judge Kane remained calm. His voice carried the weight of authority, unshaken by Maya's theatrics. "Miss Delaney, in this courtroom, we expect a certain level of respect. I trust you'll adjust your demeanor accordingly." Maya smirked, the corner of her lip curling as she drawled, "Sure, Your Honor," lacing her words with mockery. The gallery tensed. Even the courtroom reporter hesitated mid-typing. Judge Kane's expression didn't shift, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a sign of a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Maya leaned back in her chair, a picture of defiance, as Judge Kane continued. "Miss Delaney," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a warning, "the charges against you may seem trivial to someone of your stature, but let me assure you this is no trivial matter to the law or the individuals impacted by your actions." Maya stifled a laugh, her amusement unmissable. "Impacted? Oh, please," she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "No one was hurt, so what's the big deal?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Even her lawyer visibly winced, muttering something under his breath that Maya ignored. Judge Kane's eyes darkened as he closed the file in front of him with deliberate precision. The sound of the folder snapping shut echoed through the room. He removed his glasses, setting them down carefully on the bench. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the silence stretch and weigh on everyone present. "Miss Delaney," he began, leaning forward slightly, "do you recall the incident that brought you here today? Or has your sense of accountability conveniently blurred the details?" Maya rolled her eyes. "Some guy stepped onto the road when I was driving. I honked, he moved. End of story." Her tone was flippant, as though recounting an anecdote from a brunch party rather than a legal proceeding. Judge Kane's lips pressed into a thin line, but his voice remained even. "End of story, you say? Let me remind you, The individual you so carelessly refer to is Mr. Robert Sanchez, a retired paramedic. At 72 years old, Mr. Sanchez was crossing the street legally when your reckless actions forced him to stumble, resulting in a fractured wrist. Since then, he has undergone surgery and is currently undergoing physical therapy to regain full use of his hand. For the first time, Maya's smirk faltered. Her head snapped toward her lawyer, who nodded grimly. She opened her mouth to speak, but quickly shut it, unsure of how to respond. The judge's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Does that sound like no harm, no foul to you, Miss Delaney?" Maya shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I didn't hit him," she muttered, her bravado noticeably thinner. "It's not like I broke any laws. People are just so dramatic these days." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Judge Kane's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The calm in his demeanor was unnerving, almost as though he had been waiting for her to dig her hole deeper. "You believe the law is dramatic?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Do you also believe that your privilege exempts you from the consequences of your actions?" Maya hesitated, unsure if he expected an answer. She glanced at the gallery, where an older man sat quietly in the second row, his arm in a sling. His face was calm, but the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. Maya's gaze darted away, her confidence wavering further. "Let me make this clear," Judge Kane said, his voice firm. "This courtroom does not serve as a stage for entitlement. It serves justice, and today, justice demands that you face the full weight of your actions. Perhaps then, you'll begin to grasp the concept of accountability." The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Kane reached for a set of papers on the bench. He glanced at the bailiff, who nodded and stepped forward. The judge's next words would set the tone for a reckoning Maya never anticipated. Judge Kane cleared his throat, his gaze piercing through Maya's thin veneer of indifference. "Miss Delaney, given your actions and your complete disregard for their consequences, I am issuing a sentence that I believe will serve not only as a deterrent, but also as a lesson in humility and responsibility." Maya straightened in her chair, her bravado replaced with visible unease. "Wait," she blurted out, her voice sharper than she intended. "What's that supposed to mean? You're just going to give me some ridiculous fine, right? I can pay that today. No problem." The gallery murmured again, and Judge Kane allowed the noise to settle before speaking, his tone calm but commanding. "This isn't about money, Miss Delaney. You see, while financial penalties may be an inconvenience for most, for someone like you, they are nothing more than a minor inconvenience, hardly a lesson learned." Maya's jaw tightened. "So, what are you going to do? Put me in jail for parking tickets?" Judge Kane didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. "You claim no harm was done," he said, his words deliberate. "But Mr. Sanchez, the man whose life was disrupted by your recklessness, has suffered both physically and emotionally. Today he sits here, not to see you punished, but in the hope that you might understand the gravity of your actions." Maya's eyes darted toward the older man again. This time, his quiet presence seemed to unsettle her. She opened her mouth to respond, but Judge Kane raised a hand, silencing her. "I am sentencing you to 300 hours of community service," he declared, his voice steady. "Specifically, you will spend the next 30 days volunteering at a rehabilitation center for individuals recovering from physical injuries. You will work under the supervision of medical professionals, assisting patients as they rebuild their strength and mobility, something Mr. Sanchez is currently enduring thanks to you." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, a mix of approval and shock at the unconventional sentence. Maya's face turned pale, and her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. But Maya ignored him, her voice rising in protest. "You can't be serious. I'm not a nurse. I don't know anything about that kind of stuff." Judge Kane's gaze didn't waver. "You're not expected to know. You're expected to learn. Perhaps through witnessing the struggles of others, you'll come to understand the ripple effects of your actions. Failure to comply with this sentence will result in jail time, Miss Delaney. The choice is yours." Maya sat frozen, her lips parted in disbelief. For the first time, the reality of her situation seemed to sink in. The judge gestured toward the bailiff, who handed her the paperwork detailing her sentence. "This is not a punishment," Judge Kane said, his voice softening just slightly. "It's an opportunity to step outside the bubble of privilege you've lived in and to gain a perspective that money cannot buy." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Even the gallery, which had buzzed with energy moments ago, seemed to absorb the gravity of the sentence. Maya sat motionless, gripping the papers in her hands, as though they were a lifeline she didn't know how to use. As the judge stood to adjourn the hearing, he delivered a final remark that seemed to hang in the air long after he exited the courtroom. "Miss Delaney, privilege without accountability is a dangerous thing. I hope you'll use this time to recognize the value of humility, not just for yourself, but for the people whose lives you've impacted." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the session. Maya remained seated, her expression a mix of anger, disbelief, and something else, something closer to fear. For once, she had nothing to say. The gallery began to empty, whispers filling the air as people exchanged thoughts about what they'd just witnessed. Reporters outside the courthouse prepared to spin the story into headlines, but inside the courtroom, the silence lingered. Maya's lawyer leaned in once more, his voice low and urgent. "You need to take this seriously, Maya," he said. "This isn't something you can talk your way out of." But Maya didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the courtroom doors, where Mr. Sanchez had just exited. The sight of his arm in a sling and the quiet dignity with which he carried himself stirred something unfamiliar in her, a sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than Maya expected. Monday morning dawned cold and grey, the perfect backdrop for the dread pooling in her chest. As she stood outside the rehabilitation center, clutching the sentence paperwork in her manicured hands, the reality of her situation hit her like a wall. Gone was the glamour of her usual surroundings. This building was plain, practical, and brimming with the energy of people who had no time for nonsense. The glass doors slid open, and a woman in scrubs approached. She was petite, but carried herself with an air of no-nonsense authority. Her name tag read, Amara Wilson, Program Coordinator. "You must be Maya," Amara said, her tone friendly but firm. "We've been expecting you. Follow me." Maya hesitated, glancing back at the sleek black car idling at the curb. Her driver was still there. She could leave, couldn't she? But Amara didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked inside, leaving Maya no choice but to follow. The interior of the center was nothing like Maya's world of polished marble floors and gilded chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the walls were lined with motivational posters and photos of patients making progress. The sound of soft voices and the occasional scrape of wheelchairs filled the space. Amara led Maya to a small office and handed her a clipboard. "You'll need to fill this out before we get started," she said. Maya glanced at the forms and sighed dramatically. "Do I really have to do this? I mean, I'm just here to serve hours, not like join the staff," Maya said, her voice dripping with her usual entitlement. Amara's expression didn't falter. "Yes, you do," she replied simply. "And while you're here, you're expected to follow our rules and respect our patients. This isn't about serving hours, Miss Delaney. It's about serving people." The subtle emphasis on the last word made Maya bristle, but she bit back a retort. Something about Amara's calm confidence made her realize she wouldn't win this battle. So, with a heavy sigh, she began to fill out the paperwork, scrawling her name in a flourish at the bottom. "Great," Amara said when Maya handed the clipboard back. "Let's get you started." The day began with kitchen duty. Maya was tasked with chopping vegetables for lunch, a task she clearly had no experience with. She clumsily handled the knife, her perfectly manicured nails an awkward fit for the task at hand. "I could have someone else do this, you know," she muttered under her breath, earning a sharp glance from the staff member supervising her. "Here, we all contribute," the woman replied firmly. "Even you." By lunchtime, Maya was assigned to the dining area to help serve food. She carried trays to tables, awkwardly maneuvering through the room. She avoided eye contact with the patients, keeping her head down and her words to a minimum. It wasn't until she brought a tray to an older woman in a wheelchair that something began to shift. "Thank you, dear," the woman said, her voice soft but genuine. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the tray in front of her. "You're new here, aren't you?" Maya nodded, unsure of what to say. The woman smiled gently. "It's a good place, this center. It reminds you of what's really important." Maya didn't respond, but the words stayed with her. As the day went on, she began to notice things she hadn't before: the quiet resilience of the patients, the kindness of the staff, and the way everyone worked together despite their challenges. For the first time in a long time, Maya felt small, not in the way that made her angry, but in the way that made her realize how vast the world outside her bubble truly was. When the day finally ended, Maya left the center exhausted and unusually quiet. As she sat in the back seat of her car, her mind replayed the faces she had seen and the stories she had overheard. She glanced down at her phone, tempted to scroll through social media and lose herself in the shallow comforts of her usual life. But instead, she set it aside and stared out the window, her thoughts heavier than they'd been in years. The following days at the rehabilitation center proved to be a slow but steady unraveling of Maya's carefully crafted persona. She entered each morning with her usual air of indifference, but by the afternoon, the weight of the tasks and the people around her had started chipping away at her defenses. On the third day, Maya was assigned to assist during a physical therapy session. Her task seemed simple enough: help patients with light stretching exercises under the supervision of the therapist. She was paired with a man named Derek, a middle-aged construction worker recovering from a spinal injury. His broad shoulders and rough hands spoke of years of hard labor, but his eyes carried a vulnerability that caught Maya off guard. "Don't go easy on me," Derek joked, as Maya hesitated to assist him. "If I wanted to be babied, I'd have stayed home with my wife." Maya forced a laugh, unsure of how to respond. She followed the therapist's instructions, carefully guiding Derek through the stretches. At first, her movements were awkward and hesitant, but as the session went on, she found herself more focused, her usual self-consciousness fading. "You're stronger than you think," she found herself saying, surprising even herself. Derek chuckled. "Yeah, tell that to my back. But thanks for the vote of confidence." For the first time, Maya felt a small spark of connection, an unfamiliar but not unwelcome feeling. Later that afternoon, she was tasked with cleaning equipment in the therapy room. As she worked, she overheard a conversation between two patients seated nearby. One, a teenage girl named Lila with a prosthetic leg, was showing the other, an elderly man with a walker, photos of her track and field accomplishments. "I thought losing my leg was the end," Lila said with a grin, her voice brimming with pride. "Turns out it was just the beginning of something new. I'm faster now than I ever was before." Maya paused, the cleaning cloth frozen in her hand. She turned slightly, watching the two from the corner of her eye. Their laughter, their resilience, it struck a chord deep within her. How could they find joy and strength in circumstances that she couldn't even imagine enduring? That evening, Maya found herself lying awake in bed, her thoughts a jumbled mess. For years, she had dismissed people who didn't live her privileged lifestyle, assuming their struggles were due to laziness or bad choices. But now she was beginning to see the cracks in her worldview. These people weren't weak or broken. They were stronger than she could ever claim to be. By the end of her first week, Maya was no longer dragging her feet as she entered the center each morning. She began asking questions, listening to the patients' stories, and even laughing along with them. She wasn't sure when it had started, but her walls were coming down, brick by brick. One afternoon, she found herself sitting across from Mr. Sanchez. It was their first real interaction since the courtroom. His arm was still in a sling, but his demeanor was warm, almost fatherly. "Judge Kane told me you'd be here," he said with a smile. "I wasn't sure if you'd take it seriously." Maya looked down, her cheeks flushing with shame. "I didn't at first," she admitted. "I thought this was just some punishment. But now I don't know. I think maybe it's something I needed." Mr. Sanchez nodded, his gaze kind but piercing. "Humility is a tough lesson to learn, Maya, but it's one of the most important. Life isn't about what you have. It's about how you use what you've been given." Maya swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. For the first time, she felt the sting of regret, not because she had been caught, but because she had been so blind to the impact of her actions. As their conversation continued, something shifted inside her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the center of the universe. And strangely, that realization didn't feel as bad as she had always imagined. The final day of Maya's community service came faster than she expected. Over the past weeks, the arrogance and entitlement that had once defined her had been replaced by something quieter, something humbler. Her mornings were no longer filled with dread, but with purpose. She had learned the names and stories of many of the patients and staff, and for the first time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. On her last day, Amara approached Maya with a clipboard. "You've done good work here," she said, her tone softer than usual. "I'll be sending the judge my report, but I wanted to tell you this myself. You've changed. It's noticeable." Maya felt a lump rise in her throat, but managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't expect to learn so much here. About others, about myself." Amara smiled back. "That's the whole point, isn't it?" With that, she handed Maya the clipboard for one final signature and walked away. As Maya moved through the center, saying her goodbyes to patients and staff, she found herself in the therapy room where Mr. Sanchez was completing his exercises. He smiled when he saw her, setting down the resistance band he had been using. "So, this is it," he said, leaning on his cane. "Your last day?" Maya nodded, feeling an unexpected pang of sadness. "Yeah, but it doesn't feel like an ending. At least, I hope it's not." Mr. Sanchez chuckled. "Good, because lessons like this don't end when the sentence does. They stay with you, shaping how you move forward." She hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Mr. Sanchez, I just want to say I'm sorry, not just for what I did to you, but for how I acted, for the way I saw people like you, like everyone here. I was wrong." His smile widened, his eyes warm. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "But remember, Maya, the real apology is in how you live from here on out." Later that afternoon, Maya stood once again in front of Judge Kane. This time, the courtroom was quieter. There were no murmurs of gossip or cameras flashing outside. It was just her, the judge, and the echoes of a journey she hadn't expected to take. "Miss Delaney," Judge Kane began. His sharp gaze softened slightly. "You've completed your community service. I've reviewed the reports from the center, and I must say the feedback is encouraging." Maya nodded, her hands clasped in front of her. "Thank you, Your Honor, for everything." The judge tilted his head slightly. "What have you learned, Miss Delaney?" She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've learned that my actions, big or small, can ripple out and affect people in ways I never considered. I've learned that privilege doesn't make me better than anyone else. It just means I have more responsibility to use it wisely. And I've learned that empathy isn't just about feeling sorry for someone, it's about understanding them, even when their struggles are nothing like your own. Judge Kane leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's a good start," he said. "The real test, of course, is what you do with this knowledge. Court is adjourned." As Maya stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp afternoon air filled her lungs, and for the first time it felt like she could breathe. Reporters approached her, microphones thrust forward, but she simply held up a hand. "No comment," she said quietly, walking past them without a trace of her former bravado. Later that evening, as Maya sat in her apartment, she scrolled through her phone, ignoring the endless stream of gossip blogs and social media posts about her case. Instead, her fingers hovered over the contacts list until she found Amara's number. After a deep breath, she sent a text. "Hi, it's Maya. I was wondering if the center could use more volunteers. Let me know." Setting the phone down, she leaned back and exhaled. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she needed to prove herself to anyone. She didn't need the validation of likes or followers. The journey wasn't over, she knew that. But she was finally ready to take it, one step at a time. Maya's transformation became a quiet story, one that didn't trend or go viral, but resonated with those who truly mattered. Her time at the center hadn't just been a sentence, it had been a beginning. And while the world still buzzed with distractions, Maya had found something far more valuable, a sense of purpose. And sometimes that's where real change begins.